Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Friday, which means it's time for a new how to bass tutorial. And today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. So earlier in the week, some of you may have noticed on Facebook, I alluded to have made the grossest sound that you would see on a Friday. Today's Friday, and what I was talking about was right here, where it literally sounds like someone shoved a mic inches away from someone, just giving away the wettest fart. It's just so gross. It's like actually gross to listen to. Oh. So full circle, we're making farts. Anyway, this is a Serum. This sound, one guy might actually recognize this, but I was having a lesson and I was talking about archetypal sort of dubstep sounds, and this one came up, and what this is just, I mean, I'm going to show you obviously, but sort of what it is, it's wavetable based. It's got bending going on in terms of like bend plus minus on each would have a massive. I'm using the remap, but it's basically just a version of the bend. Then it's distorted, and it's got a high pass filter, and it's got the formant holes a la Virtual Riot, and then it's vocoded and it's compressed, and then it makes the growl. However, the title of this is folded something. I haven't actually figured out what I'm going to call it yet, but it's folded because there's folding involved. And the discussion came into the folding because what I was trying to zero in on is how, before Serum existed, before FM was really well understood as it is now, how people got super squelchy, like really over squelchy, like just so ridiculously squelchy sounds, but with with massive, not even using FM. I mean, using FM insofar as massive allows you to, but not so much beyond, what we do with Citrus. So the thought came, what tools were in massive at the time that allowed you to do that kind of thing? And so that was whatever wavetable you're using. The bend plus and minus was a big part of it. FM and as well was a big part of it. But then there's one more thing that I haven't really messed around with a lot, and that is the folding. There's a thing in massive called the Sine Shaper. And I might actually be 100%. No, I'm not. I was about to say that I was wrong about that, but I'm not wrong about this because I verified it by comparing it to the Sine folder here. But the Sine Shaper and the Sine folder are the same basic process. But what this essentially does is that it's a wave shaper, but you're putting waves in it. It's really I could be technically correct about what I'm saying, but visualizing this in a way that's going to make sense if you don't know what I'm talking about already is going to be kind of hard. But basically, this is where you do this kind of thing. Where is wave? Bam. You can see how this shows up here, and this puts more or less this shape in the waveform. And the thing about FM and its squelchiness is that it sort of is this basic shape if you leave it alone. But what we're doing it, if you modulate the pregain in here, this essentially changes how many of these the sound goes through. And in the case of the Serum, I'm just doing that, but with the drive control, which we can even see it happening while I'm doing it. Interesting distinction about what's going on here is that this seems to fold more in the center than it does on the outside, and there might be a reason for that about what folding technically is, because folding I've actually seen referenced as a specific kind of shape that's being a specific kind of distortion. Even it's not even really part of wave shaping. It's just that it happens to have a shape that can be done with the wave shaper if you knew enough about it to actually do it. Which I guess I'm not really sure how I would do this. Just do like that, and then this is a way not elegant in compared to what was going on in there. And in fact, this is probably not gonna happen at all. Whatever. So I'm gonna have to investigate that. But I also noticed a similarity from when I FM particular parameters of a wave shaper and my literal hardware wave shaper that seemed to look like folding. So that's kind of interesting about the hardware approach. But point being is that the freaking side folding effect here is pretty important, and I'll show you when I'm doing the beginning from the bottom up kind of thing here. But just listen to its impact it has if I just turn it off, even with everything on. I mean, obviously, any amount of distortion would have made it a little bit better, but it wouldn't have that particular quality to it. It adds to the squelch. So let's talk about what's going on here from the beginning to end. If you're wondering what this toggle business is, I have in the processing tab here external window make bridge, which allows it to be the correct size as opposed to it being a tiny Serum, which is what we don't normally have when we ideally Serum on my 4K monitor. So I'm using the Monster 5. If you didn't notice, by the way, any of the tables that are inside the factory Serum library that have SL in the name of it are made by me. They were made by me. This is one of my tables. And I have a saw wave here, but the saw wave isn't doing anything to this except for just by being there. There's also the sub on. Let's turn off all the various effects. And that's what's going into everything. Now, I have this saw wave on because this by itself happening the way that it is fine. I have some unison engaged, and normally I try to avoid this particular effect, that kind of thing that happens, because I have the phase random is all the way off and the phase all the way to the beginning, which means that it's all starting completely in phase. There's no phase split whatsoever. So that means that it starts together, and then kind of you get that phase cancellation. That sounds very noisy-esque. And I normally try to avoid that for a sound like this, just because it's usually very obvious and sort of not totally great. But we're able to do some things with the effects later that actually sort of take advantage of it. Although my thought process for having created this was not that I did this first and then was going to make something that was going to use it. As a decision that I made later. And in fact, a lot of decisions like that about like specific positions of the table, specific kind of remap I used here, the unison thing, the phase thing, all of those things were decisions that I made when I had the whole chain done. Because while you can sort of do this and that you understand what you're going to do is going to sound like, it's a little bit easier to have it all done and then make those kinds of changes, because then it'll make things sound in ways that you weren't expecting, and it sometimes can help to make a much more fine-tuned sound to have the starting settings interact a bit more favorably with the post-processing, because you can see it happen in real time. Speaking of the remap, it's like slightly offset sort of bend. If this were in the center and you just had like a slope bend and a slope out, that would be the bend, plus or minus, I forget which. And so essentially what I'm doing is I'm making the bend, but I'm making the center of the bend, which is to say that where it's squeezing or into or out of is moved down to a little bit. So we still get kind of like the squelchiness, but we also get the sharpness. Because if you remember, bend plus and minus, it had a somewhat different effect on the sound. I believe it was plus that had it come together in the center. Whichever one makes it come in the middle is what is similar in terms of output to what it would be like if you were to FM it, which is what creates the squelching sound. And then the output makes it sound sharper and makes it feel more like something like a saw wave. It's something that's all very together. It's very sharp. It's one of those. So it's a combo of the two because of the way that's positioned. Yes. And then I had the saw wave. But the saw wave, this actually is one of those decisions as well. So this saw wave was introduced specifically because when I put all the stuff together and played the sound together, like that kind of made sense, but like you might be thinking that doesn't sound all that different. That's because the folding is having quite a huge impact on the tone of everything here. But having the saw wave interact with it makes some of the frequencies kind of a little bit sharper. Because this is a very phasey, very not solid sound, even though it's a wavetable, it's the same thing every time. Because of the remap, because of the unison, because of the modulations, the way that I'm having it, it becomes a very kind of washy, phasey thing. If I want to retain any sharpness whatsoever, I gotta have something that's sharp. So this is just a saw wave with nothing else happening other than I'm modulating the level, so that particular parts of the modulation will have more or less of the saw wave in there to just change that. And you can, mess around with that to determine how the level of that I guess you want. But the effect, at least, especially now, when only at this stage, it becomes a lot more apparent when we talk about the post-processing. I'll show you when we get there. So the distortion was the first thing that happened. And then there's an EQ because damn. And then there's the high pass. So kind of interesting. I didn't actually expect this to be an outcome, but I have the sub on out here. It's going direct out, which means it's not being processed by any of these effects. And because I'm doing the high pass inside Serum as opposed to doing it in the EQ and post, that means that the sub actually stays on and stays together all the way to the end of the chain, which is fortuitous as hell. Indeed. So as far as there's the sine fold, there's linear fold. Sine fold is a bit more squelchy, and linear fold is still pretty squelchy, but it's fuzzier. It's slightly sharper in terms of, it has higher frequency ramifications, I guess. The distortion affects the higher that's what, whenever, fuzzy is one of those stupid buzzwords that I try to avoid using a lot, but like the term fuzzy is actually pretty interesting in terms of onomatopoeia, because it actually is kind of like what the sound is supposed to be. Fuzz. The higher frequencies are they're hazy. If you looked at the spectrum, you would actually see that, okay, it's kind of fuzzy up there now, as opposed to what sine folding would do, which would certainly do a lot of that. There's definitely be lots of that, but that's that kind of like papery, kind of warbly, whatever. Shut up, Steven. Anyway, we're done with the serum. This is what serum is. Good job, serum. Oh, wait, there's one more thing. I actually learned about this today. The same lesson where I was actually doing this. The student actually told me about how the fact you can come in here and you can change the bends you can change the actual freaking transfer curve of your modulations inside serum. And so this is the macro is going into the distortion drive. So that means that it's not actually linearly changing the drive according to this range here. It's actually sticking more towards the low end and then creeping up on the higher end near the end of the modulation. So the whole modulation actually stays a little bit lower than what would betray the purely linear version of this. Yeah. So the EQ, this EQ is one of these things that I did when from after I already had Vocodex. Like Vocodex was the first step, which was just have Vocodex. As usual, Vocodex has lots of complicated things I'm doing with it to make it something that we can use. I guess we'll talk about bandwidth. So I had 33 bands, which is pretty low. Release and the time variables are a lot smaller than usual, but minimum time still on. They can only be so small. I turned off all the contour stuff, and the contour stuff by default, if you're not paying attention up here when you turn up Vocodex by default, is that like this is the modulator mix in here, and it's on by default. It has contours. Now the contouring is where we are changing. We're changing particular frequencies of the original, like coming through, basically volume wise, so that it still plays like with the vocoding, so that it sounds like it belongs to it, as opposed to just being on top of it. Thing is, that I don't usually like there being that in there. The modulator has a high pass filter. It's usually pretty high by default, and the carrier has a low pass filter, which we're turning in a little bit to let the sub through. So that's nice. The wet is up and the sound equalizer is up. Now the wet and the mix, these are relative. So like if I didn't have any of these on, then like how loud the wet is wouldn't change that much. And because the sound equalizer is on, it's all being compressed into that, which is why it's like that. So if you didn't have sound equalizer on, it would be a little bit more like you would expect the levels to be, but because we're leveling at the compression, it sometimes isn't so much that the thing that you're turning down actually is getting quieter, so much as the other thing is getting louder. So funky ramification of leveling in the compression. So the bandwidth is relatively high, but this is the bandwidth window, which is changing the bandwidth per band. If you didn't know you could do that, you can. And I ruined it forever. Whatever, close enough. As you see, minor changes to this kind of thing create sort of wide tonal shifts. Wider bands, lower bands, I'm just going to copy the value here because I fuck it up forever. If it occurred to some of you to automate this parameter along with the modulation, I've done that before and it does work out pretty great. I was going to say, oh yeah, so remember that how we're using vocoding here is that this is just in the chain and there's no really any modulator. So the sound that we're making is its own carrier and modulator, which means that when we band width all the way the hell up, it really just sounds like the carrier by itself because it just is. There's not enough split in the modulator information and in the bands and all that stuff for it to impact the original sound other than just being on all the time. So that's what the value of the bandwidth is there. And then we turn the pitch down, but I also mess around with the modulator pitch shift window. This causes just change in the overall tone. And like you might be being like, well, what changed? I'm like, well, the literal thing that's happening is that this is essentially doing what the pitch parameter does, but on a per band basis, much like the other graph did what the bandwidth does. And I just move it around until it sounds good. In the band gain window, I turned down all the lower bands because there was some serious weird bass shenanigans going on. And like this is why I'm super glad about the way the sub from Serum worked out, because vocoding almost universally screws up your sub, and you're going to have to replace it one way or another. So this is a pretty easy way to do it. In the band distribution window, normally you would see the band look like this, and I moved down to here. I'm wondering what the hell did that do? Well, when it's up like this, the bands can only occupy a space up till about here. And then if I do this, now the bands can occupy the entire space. And I didn't really do a lot more. I didn't do anything at all with it beyond that, actually. So I'm not going to explain super deeply about what the band distribution window does, because it's a little bit difficult to grasp. Because just because of the way that they present it, just because of the visual way that they represent the change to the bands, it makes it hard to really grasp what it does. But this sound didn't really rely too much on that, so I'm glad. And not a single other thing happened inside Vocodex. So now, putting the holes in here. Man, I really boned that up. Bam. Good thing I saved stuff. That's where I saved it? Damn. Okay, well, in that case, we're going to go find a backup. Like 1618, what the hell time is it? It's probably here. This is fine. There it is. Cool. Wasting time, the SeamlessR way. So, we got ourselves the Vocodex and the EQ. Here's the Vocodex without the EQ. Here's the Vocodex with the EQ. So, in this case, what this technique is originally designed to do is that you essentially put big holes in the spectrum, which, when moving up and down against the frequencies of the original sound, which you might be thinking, well, they're not moving. How are they moving? Well, the original one is, because along with modulating the actual modulation, I'm also changing pitch. So that means that when the pitch is moving up, the frequencies are moving up with it, and the bands are not. So that means that the frequencies are moving through the bands, as opposed to the bands moving through the frequencies. The result is somewhat similar, though. Somewhat. It's not entirely identical. But this does sort of elicit interesting format changes, and going into Vocodex especially, this is important because that's the sort of thing Vocodex pays attention to. But also in this case, I am using this as like an actual equalization method by getting rid of some particular treble frequencies. And normally I wouldn't recommend cutting it so fiercely, but then this is sort of doing double duty of being in like an actual mixing EQ plus also sound design by creating formatty holes. And then Maximus, where I very just sort of crushed everything out pretty high. The only really interesting sound design I've done here was that in the mids, oh dear, in the mids, one the hell second, yeah, in the mids and the highs, I have way lower time variables. In fact, in the highs, I have no time variables, and that's because I wanted to actually distort those frequencies, and that's what happens when you turn up all the time variables, because the thing that separates compression from distortion, actually they're both compression. The thing that separates compressors from distortion is that compressors have time variables, which allow the unit to interact and react rather to the input, so that it can change whether or not it's distorting or how fast it reacts, that kind of stuff. I mentioned this before. Can't be news to you. So on the mid, same thing, pretty low values. So it doesn't have to be offered to distort. It just has to oscillate faster than the wavelength of whatever sound's coming in. So for mid frequencies, that's a particular value, but for high frequencies, that's a much higher value. And for lower frequencies, that's a much lower value. So it means to say that lower frequencies, being bass frequencies, have larger bandwidth, which means that you can have slower time variables that will actually still distort it. Because if it reacts faster than the oscillation, then that means that it's going to change the shape of the waveform. What does that sound like? It sounds like wave shaping, if you didn't catch the play on words, because maybe you're not a native English speaker. I also sort of did this low cut thing here, which by default is actually cutting things at 20 hertz, but we don't see it represented in the band over here. But I opened it a little bit because of aforementioned strange bass business, which was still happening because of Vocodex. Vocodex really does a number on subs, so yeah. And then EQ. Entirely. I mean, the way that this looks just looks like I just should have gone to Maximus and just turned down the sub a bit so that it was all sort of even, and then, post gained. The thing about elegant post-processing, like, the word elegant to me basically means no wasted steps. You didn't do things, or like do things in a loop. Like, I did this to do this, but then ultimately did that, but where I could have just done that. Like, that's what elegant is, when you just do that as opposed to doing all that. But it would be an infuriating lifetime of work to try and eliminate all unnecessary steps. So doing a little of some unnecessary steps is fine, just as long as it gets you where you want to go. So don't worry too much about that. But it's also good to know that you could have done it in less steps, and then maybe next time you do. But don't sweat it too hard. So let's talk about the automation, because that matters too. Because we're using Serum, we can't use slide notes inside FL. So this means that I'm using actual volume automation. I'm just putting down notes here. Here's some notes. They're just being notes. And then here's the pitch automation, which is like variously not anywhere near what the notes are doing. And then here's the actual physical automation for the macro inside Serum, which is doing everything, all the modulation at all. Like every single thing is happening because of this, which is being linked to the wavetable position, the warp position, the distortion, the distortion drive, effects fill frequency. What the hell is that? Oh, the filter, derp. The filter, effects filter, yeah. And then the volume of the saw. So all of that's happening. And then nothing, I'm not automating anything in Vocodex or Maximus or EQs or any of that. Like, it's just all from inside Serum. So that's what this is controlling. And that's important. It's an important thing to think about, because certain plugins, certain platforms, certain things are going to have, they're going to behave differently in the particular kinds of shapes of automation. You notice that there isn't really sharp automation here. There's sharp out automation, which is to say that it stops particularly quickly, and not necessarily sharp in automation where it begins that quickly. And it's not because it doesn't work, because it does just fine. It's just that it doesn't. It's not the kind of sharp that I look for. It's something that I'm more used to doing inside Citrus, just because I'm used to it. Been using it for 12 years. Anyway, some of the automation here though does matter, because this is a particularly expressive sound. For example, just take this very first thing that happens here. This, obviously, like how long it takes to rise. Like, this is pretty basic. Just especially because it seems like even some lower amounts of this automation aren't really going anywhere. But like this flat thing that's happening here, because you could just do one of these, right? One of this pretty double curve. Geez, pretty normal, like. Kind of see how that works out versus having a bit of a flat. And then also where this flat top is matters quite a bit as well. And then if it actually is flat, or if it's moving in the direction. And so, like, I had the double curve in there because some of these are double curves, and like their motion matters a bit as well, but this is a little bit more subtle. But the automation that I wanted to talk about was mostly the flat tops, and just the idea that like the different flat tops could get you different sounding modulations. Early on in my sound design sort of learning, I would hear songs that would do that, the way I would go up high. And then like the next one would go up at a different position, and it would sound like different modulation, because I just assumed that for all wobs and purposes that people were going to modulate 100% all the time. That if they wanted it to be less or more than a particular range, that they would just make that range less. But if you have a whole longer range and you could stop in particular positions, that given that you're processing everything else properly, so that there's not like a level difference, it sounds just like different modulation that you're getting from the same sound. And that's particularly important for a sound like this. So it makes it so that you can get a lot more work done out of it without having to like clone it and like make changes. So then there's this thing. What the goddamn happened there? Well, it's already preloaded to begin with, and then the pitch automation just goes all the way down, which I have inside Serum all the way up, in terms of range, 2 octaves up, 2 octaves down, and automating it. And then, so that goes up, and then the modulation goes up. And so basically what's happening is that way the hell down there, if you play low enough notes, you get like the super long wavelengths, which gives us that super slow oscillation. And then we're just hearing all the individual intermediary bits of the waveform that we normally don't perceive because it's happening too fast. So that whipping sound happening there is actually pretty important, because, and actually this is something I run into when I use the hardware a bit. If I want to modulate a filter with filter FM, and I put it on the filter and have it FM at a particular filter speed, and then I use a saw wave for that, right? So if I use the regular normal saw wave where it begins high and goes low, I get a pretty sharp output. But if I do the opposite, where it starts low and goes high, and I get a ramp, and a ramp gets you that squeezy kind of feel in there. And because of the remap, not because of the saw wave. Actually, yeah, I guess because of the saw wave. That's hilarious. I thought this was an opposite phase. So that gets us that particular result. So that's it. When played slow enough, I mean, not even really that slow, it gets whippy. And the whippy adds to the overall squelch. The squanch. And then like this guy. Like, I would ask people when I was learning how to do, not necessarily this kind of sound design, but similar enough sound design that I was like, how do I do whatever? And they're just being like, don't be afraid to modulate pitch. Like, people don't talk about modulating pitch, but you should modulate pitch. And I'm like, 100% didn't know what they're talking about. But what they meant was that, like, even subtle, tiny pitch changes, along with modulation changes, dramatically change the tone of things. Even if it's, like, pretty basic stuff. And, like, for a long time, I would just stay static about what notes I'm playing and that kind of thing. I would lose out on, and then I would go try to do modulation that was just changing pitch. So many people, like, I played the low note. This sound isn't going to do it, but, like, you do any of the other really tight, really sharp sounding carriers that you put into modulators, that you put into vocals to make really growls that people make or whatever, and then like you play it an octave lower and you get the really, really, like, you get a much longer waveform, so you get more of that texture that comes out of it. But people don't get it. That's how that was done. Like that, like, it's more or less a regular growl. It's just that you play it an octave lower. They think there's some kind of modulation going on at the regular octave that creates that texture. It's not. It's just pitch. It's just something that we're not really used to thinking about in terms of like being part of like the texture creation. And why wouldn't it be the same throughout all the rest of the octaves? But no, it's actually quite different. Different keys, even different roots, different pitch motion. So yes, that's that. I will put up this FLP, or maybe that one that I had backed up, saved, to make sure it's the right one. But this one will be, you'll have this one form or another. Hopefully it works. I'm using Serum and Vocodex and whatever. And you can mess around with it. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.